Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. So this video is finally done. So many things happened this month, which I might talk about a bit at the end. But anyway, not too many vehicles to cover today, but as they're all fairly unique, this video is still fairly long, I guess. So timestamps should be in the comments below if you'd like to skip ahead. Anyway, let's get into it. As always, I really hope you enjoy. So first off today we have the JPZ-45, a highly mobile tank destroyer with the same gun as the RU-251. And although it's very fast and with a very potent gun, it's the survivability tied with a lack of turret that really lets it down. Its armour is superficial really. Every conventional tank cannon you can meet around this BR will be able to cut through it. The only thing it protects against is autocannons really. The gun though will work fine when upgraded. This thing's stock round is a PCR, so you're going to want to go for the heat or the Hesh as fast as possible, and thankfully the heat is only a tier 2 mod, so hopefully that won't take too long. Apart from the stock APCR round, this gun is identical to the RU-251's gun, although the reload is shorter at 7.2 second stock compared to the RU's 9.8, which is a decent upgrade. However, because this tank of course has no turret, it's a lot less functional than the RU, and again, even the previous tank in the line, the Bulldog, arguably has more viability down to the turret. Even though this tank has impressive speed, as it lacks the turret, it can't use that speed to be aggressive to the same degree the other light tanks can. Because this tank of course has to be pointed towards an enemy to fire, and if you're on the flanks that leaves your side open to fire, and if you get hit in the engine it's game over. This makes it quite difficult to skulk around behind enemy lines, as reacting to enemies always take a few seconds longer than this tank, as it needs to first turn the hull, level off the gun, and then scope the enemy in. This annoyingly makes the speed advantage it has somewhat less effective, as flanking and pushing around behind enemy lines isn't really a viable choice with this vehicle most of the time. It's another of those vehicles where its speed is almost a detriment to it, as it's easy to get carried away and just drive until you meet an enemy, which really isn't the way to go. What this tank does do well though is snipe. The heat round of course will work great at range, and in tandem with this the JPZ has high zoom on the scope, so once you get the hang of how the velocity works, it won't be too hard to go for ammo racks or certain crew members. Additionally, as it's also very small, hitting this thing at range is fairly tricky, and even then if incoming rounds start getting close, you can use the very responsive reverse gear to zip away out of sight and re-engage. Most of the time, if you're confident with the lead, you'll have around 3 shots on an enemy before they can react and range you in, as this thing's reload is pretty good. The heat isn't the most damaging round, and it'll certainly struggle to take out the American heavies, but for most vehicles, especially Russian vehicles, they should be able to finish off enemies in a few hits. The main problem with this vehicle though is that it doesn't offer a huge amount of advantage over the M41 Bulldog that comes before it. It's faster in a straight line, but even then the acceleration is slower. The gun is more damaging with the higher caliber and around 70mm of extra penetration, but the reloads are very similar, and the Bulldog is turreted, which for a light vehicle is almost a necessity for the playstyle. And personally I'd honestly take the Bulldog out over this vehicle just because it adds so much more versatility to the lineup and to the playstyle itself. This tank can work really well, but it requires so much more effort to make it truly excel, whereas the Bulldog and the RU require much less effort and perform fine, really. The JPZ is much better at sniping, but that's a fairly small niche and not even a viable playstyle on some maps. These other light tanks can snipe too, and also perform as light scouts, running the flanks and supporting the team, and the JPZ just can't really do that. Pros: good mobility, fast reload, and good firepower. At the cons: poor survivability and low versatility. What's our verdict? Well, it's a toss-up between consider it and avoid it really, and I'm leaning towards avoid it. If you can get the JPZ in a good spot, it can work really well, but combined to the Bulldog, it just has so much less applicability in battle, and especially if you're a newer player, you'll likely get better results with the Bulldog. I'd only really recommend this over the Bulldog and the RU if you're very confident with your map knowledge. All in all though, I'd like to see this thing get active scouting really. If it did, I'd probably consider taking it over the Bulldog, as it would give it a bit more substance. For now though, it's not really worth taking out. Next up, back to some light vehicles with the German BMP-1. There's no real differences between this version and the Russian and Chinese variants, apart from the decals on the turret that you can't take off. Now, the BMP-1 is more of a support light tank when compared to vehicles like the Bulldog and RU, which can be a bit more aggressive. as the BMP-1 is very vulnerable pretty much constantly, and even though it has all of the assets to be aggressive, more often than not it'll get taken out before you can really do a whole lot of damage. This tank comes with basically two sets of weaponry options. Stock, you have an auto-loading 73mm main gun at 6 seconds fixed, and an ATGM that you need to guide with the keyboard that's not amazingly consistent. But when you unlock the BMP-1P upgrade module, you get a much more effective mouse-aim ATGM, but the autoloader is removed. However, the reload without the autoloader is actually faster if you have a decent crew, so you'll suffer no real drawbacks in using the P upgrade really. The main gun of the BMP isn't hugely effective over most ranges. It's a heat round that can cut through a max of 300mm of flat armour, but the velocity is fairly slow at only 665 meters per second, and unless you're confident with the gun, you'll likely be missing a few shots at range, which isn't great for this sort of tank as it works best when it's completely unseen, and missing a few shots is usually enough to get you spotted. Of course, you never really want to be spotted while playing any light vehicle, but because the BMP is so large and easy to hit, it's even more important that you stay hidden. This tank has its advantages at long range and close range, but there are notable drawbacks for each playstyle. At close range, the main cannon is much easier to use, and due to this thing's speed, it can flank fairly well. But you are much more vulnerable here, as if you get seen, you're basically already dead. Additionally, because the turret is positioned centrally, you can't peek corners at all. So if an enemy is aware of you, you can't do anything but let them come to you, and that's not always going to be the way most engagements play out. Also, wherever you fight, as the main gun doesn't have the best damage output, I'd aim to disable the breach or cannon first, and then finish them off with your next shots. You can't afford to take a hit from anything, so removing your enemy's ability to fire is the most important aspect to staying in the fight. The reload rate of the cannon and ATGM is generally so fast that engaging enemies this way won't really lose you much time overall, and will largely keep you in the fight longer. As well, be aware of soft cover like fences and bushes while you're playing the BMP. It can only fire chemical rounds that get triggered on soft cover, so there's a bit of a risk in playing it in urban areas with fences or around lots of foliage, as again, a misfire like that could alert enemies to your position, which you really want to avoid. At long range though, you can keep yourself a bit more protected in the terrain by hiding your hull and using the upgraded ATGM to hit enemies over distances, which is pretty consistent. However, your main gun is very tricky to use here, and as you only have 4 ATGMs, once they're expended, you're going to need to advance. Overall, I found the most consistency with this vehicle playing at long range from the start of the match, using up the ATGMs in scouting, and then pushing into the map to try and support the team and put the main cannon to use. At close range, the ATGMs will still work fine, but you might as well use them at distances where you can keep yourself safe. Because of the mobility, the BMP can react to how the match plays out fairly easily. If the team is pushing and doing well, you can quite comfortably join them and push as long as you stay around cover. As well, if this is how the match is going, I would consider pushing to a friendly cap point to replenish your ATGMs as well. The mobility does also allow for an aggressive push early in the match to get to a good camping position. You don't want to be caught out on the move of course, but if you can reach a good spot before enemies push too far into the map, you can really be a menace just down to how fast this thing can fire. So, although sticking to range is safest and arguably the most consistent, if you have good knowledge of the map you're on and know where the good positions are, using the BMP's speed once upgraded to play in a spot like this is a good call, as it really lets you maximise its potential. It is a risk, but if you can play somewhat concealed, you'll likely get a fair few kills and a lot of scouts. Pros: great firepower options, fast reload, and mobile. And the cons: poor survivability, and low versatility. Verdict: I would get this one. It can be a bit harder to use than the Bulldog, but it easily has more potential, especially in the high tiers. And really, a tank like this, at least as far as the game is concerned, is sort of designed to be knocked out so you can take out cheap casts, and for that it's great. The rapid firing of the cannon and ATGM combined with the speed to get caps and the scouting ability really gets you a lot of spawn points. It's great at getting assists too, so if you're a fan of maximising your cast potential, the BMP-1 is a really good choice. Next up is something a bit different. This is the Raketen Jagdpanzer II, a pure ATGM vehicle. It's on the hull of the JPZ-45s, the armour and mobility are identical here. The missile it uses is the SS-11, which has pretty high damage and penetration. It can cut through 600mm of flat armour with nearly 3.5 kilograms of explosive filler, which is massive really. However, it isn't mouse aim, so you'll need to use the keyboard controls to aim them. It comes with 14 missiles, and each launching mechanism has a separate ammo pool, so if you fire only using the left missile, it'll eventually run out of ammo and not use up any ammo for the right missile. The launchers can depress slightly as well, which can be useful for firing over angled terrain, and as well as this, each missile can traverse 90 degrees to the side, which adds even more versatility. So the missiles are fairly hard to aim, but they do a lot of damage when they hit, and because of how the missiles are set up, you can fire on enemies while being completely concealed behind cover, which is a huge advantage really. So this is a location I'd aim to play around. Make sure if you can that at all times your hull is covered, as any APHE round, or well, any round really, is likely going to one-shot the tank from the front. The next hurdle is working out what range is the best to play at, and mid-range seems to be the most consistent. At close range, the missiles can miss quite easily, and as the reload is fairly long, you could get caught out on close proximity. At long range, you're very safe and can engage a lot of targets, but keyboard-controlled missiles are very hard to aim over distances, and if an enemy is on the move, it's likely they'll be able to dodge your missile. As well as this, from long range, you can't really engage enemies in partial cover. As this missile is so slow, any enemy will have plenty of time to back off into cover to avoid it. Mid-range is really the best of both worlds. You're still protected, and at around 500 to 800 meters or so, the missile won't be too hard to aim. And at that range, chances are enemies won't have quite enough time to react to the incoming missile and dodge it. It does still work at close range and long range, but the middle distances are where it has the most advantages. A good thing about this vehicle as well is that it works on most maps where the other tanks you have access to don't. It can utilise any area of the map with hard cover, which is a huge asset. And it also works fairly well in up tiers, as your armour doesn't really hold it back at all if you're in complete cover, all the while the missiles will still do heaps of damage. It doesn't have huge viability on flat or urban maps though. You could play it aggressively, running up to enemies and shotgunning them with the missiles, and this is good for a bit of fun, but not really if you're looking to grind and really get the most out of the vehicle. I'd play it on maps with long sight lines and plenty of hills or ridgelines to choose from. That's where this tank works best, as if you're playing it out in the open, you might as well have just played a normal tank. This thing doesn't really work well out of cover or on the move at all really. You can't actually fire the missiles on the move and need to be at a complete stop. And on top of this, as they're fairly slow, chances are if an enemy sees you and can hit you, they're likely going to take you out before you've even come to a stop and way before you've launched the missile. So cover is very much your friend. Also, try and pick as open an area to cover as possible. If you're watching a sightline with lots of hard cover, if you miss a shot, an enemy will just rush to the closest piece of cover and try and wait you out. And this can be really tedious, as you can't really push an opponent in this position, so if possible, try and cover a long open stretch of field to maximise your killing potential. Pros: good mobility, great firepower, and can fire from concealment. And the cons: poor survivability and low versatility. Verdict: even though it's fairly situational, not the easiest tank to use, I'd still get it. Being able to fire from behind complete cover is a huge advantage, and as well, it'll work great in up tiers where some of the other vehicles you have access to won't. It wouldn't be the first tank I take out on most maps, but in the right situation it can work really, really well. Next up is the M48A2C, another American tank in German service. This is a fairly new addition and caused a little bit of controversy recently, as there are M48s in the American and Chinese tree at a BR higher at 7.3, whereas this German one is at 7.0. As well as this, the German version has a slightly improved engine, making it a bit faster, so it's better and at a lower BR, and this is apparently down to how it's performing. I'm told it's performing around 4 times worse than the American and Chinese M48, and this likely is down to the algorithm picking up all the new players rushing to play it stock all at once with the ever-present stock APCR round and performing poorly. Its performance overall isn't helped by the lack of lineup for it either. It could be either of these things or a number of other factors, but for the moment it's 7.0. Although I imagine when everything levels out it will join the other M48s in the future. The M48 itself though, when upgraded, is a very effective tank, and one that can be obnoxiously summed up as a tank, in that it's one of those vehicles that can just do everything. Its mobility is effective and responsive, the armour can be good, and the firepower as well has the potential to deal with basically anything. Annoyingly, this tank does come with a stock APCR round, but it does have access to APHE at tier 1 and a heat round at tier 3. The APHE round doesn't have a huge amount of penetration, but due to the filler, if it does penetrate, it will do a lot of damage and likely one-shot without too much trouble. Mobility as well lets this tank do everything it needs to. It can sit in the low 40s off-road and turn and maneuver very easily when the mobility upgrades are unlocked. It also has a 12km/h reverse gear, which is pretty nice. Armour as well can be surprisingly effective, although not consistent. Apart from weak spots like the turret ring and cupola, a fair few APHE rounds will struggle getting through this thing. The upper plate of the hull will bounce pretty much all APHE rounds, and common guns like the American 90 will really struggle getting through the turret as well. Overall, your armour will likely save you from snapshots taken quickly, but if an enemy has the time to aim at you, they will likely pick out a suitable weak spot, so again, a bit like the King Tigers, you can wiggle around a bit. The hull traverse is good, so in swinging it from side to side and making little movements with your turret, you can really throw off your enemy's aim. Although if you're doing this, be careful not to overdo it, as the side armour of the turret and hull is very weak. This tank is close to being universally capable, which basically means that there's no set playstyle that works best overall, because it doesn't have any huge detrimental disadvantages to nullify. It can brawl at close range if you're careful and upgraded, and snipe effectively as well, as it does have a rangefinder. There are a few things to avoid though. The cupola is an APHE trap, so if you're cresting a hill, an enemy with APHE can fire into your cupola and have a chance of wiping out the turret crew before you even get a chance to take a shot. So if you are in this situation, don't peek over cover if an enemy is watching you, as they will likely disable you before you even get a chance. As well, be careful when driving around corners, as the side armour is very weak, so either try to roll the hull around the corner, or if an enemy is watching you, you could try baiting a shot with your angled front plate, but only if your enemy doesn't have sabot or heat, as there are ammo racks in the front of the hull. The last thing to consider is what round to main, really, the APHE or the heat. The APHE doesn't have a huge amount of penetration but loads of damage potential, and the heat has high penetration but a smaller cone of damage, although it will almost always blow up an ammo rack if it hits one. At 7.0 you can probably get away with maining the APHE round for some quicker kills, although at the higher BRs I'd main the heat but take a fair amount of APHE as well. Disable with the heat, and finish off with the APHE. If you main the APHE round, you run the risk of meeting T29s, T54s, Conquerors, etc., which you can knock out frontally with the APHE, but you need to hit some quite finicky weak spots. So for safety and longevity, I would main the heat round when you unlock it. Pros: good mobility, decent armour, and great firepower. And the cons: constant weak spots. Verdict: I'd easily get this one. At its BR it can be a menace, its rounds negate all armour really, and it has the mobility to get the tank where it needs to be, and just enough armour to save you from time to time. And really that's all you can ask for. It will stop excelling at the higher BRs, but even then it's a decent backup due to the heat round. This one is easily worth spading. So next up, probably the most famous tank this tier, the Leopard 1. A brand new design and the start of a new direction for German tanks. The Leo is very mobile and equipped with the 105mm L7 cannon with sabot, hesh and heat, pretty standard. It also gets a rangefinder too. As for its speed, it can cruise at just under 50 km/h off-road, which is pretty great. On top of this, it's very responsive to input and can reverse, turn and manoeuvre effortlessly really. What it sacrifices though is armour and protection. The hull front is 70mm thick, and the turret does have some armoured spots, but largely you won't be bouncing rounds from any contemporary guns, even SPA can cut through the turret. So, like most tanks with weak armour, the Leo works best when it's unseen, which means that you don't really want to be playing at close range. There's no benefit at all really to actively choose to play the Leo in close quarters, as it basically loses all the advantages here pretty much. The gun works great at range, and with the rangefinder you'll have no trouble landing shots, and the mobility easily allows for you to be able to duck in and out of cover to pop off shots, reposition and run around the map easily. At close range, all that really changes is that enemies will have an easier time taking you out. Frontally, this thing is a one-shot for APHE. At some angles, certain APHE rounds might bounce on the upper plate, but the lower plate, turret and angled sides are always going to be a really easy shot to penetrate. And as well, sabot and heat of course will likely be able to disable your critical components through the hull as well. Because this thing is so mobile, and additionally because this tank might actually be the first truly mobile vehicle you'll unlock in the tree, if you choose to skip the light tank line, you might find yourself getting carried away with the Leo's mobility, and really that's the most detrimental aspect to this vehicle in my opinion. This is something I've mentioned before, but I will bring it up again here. In this game, it's very easy to kick into autopilot where you don't really think about where you're going in the map. You just hold W until you see combat, and that works well enough for vehicles that can somewhat rely on their armour, but it doesn't work at all with the Leopard. And because it's so quick, you might find this happening quite often. You're never going to want to drive out into the map to plan on fighting enemies head on. Because this tank is so weak, you'll likely lose. In a one-on-one fight in the open on equal ground against other 7.7 MBTs, the Leo has the least passive advantages. But you do have the assets to make sure you can engage enemies from an advantageous position and not meet them in a head-on situation like this. So, you're going to want to disengage that autopilot in your head and beeline for a ridgeline or sniping spot in cover and engage at range. The heat is a bit tricky to land at range, but the Sabo is quite easy, but in any case, if you have the rangefinder unlocked, this won't really be a problem. The Leo easily works best at long distances. You're harder to hit, and your cannon will still be able to hit hard from miles away. Compared to the other 7.7s, the Leo excels in mobility where the others generally excel more in armour, so your mobility is what you need to focus on to beat your enemies. But just don't use it to rush into the middle of the map or to a cap point to engage at close range. Use that mobility to head to a decent spot and cover a sightline at distance if possible. Also, remember to hide your hull too. Your turret is the weakest part of the armour frontally, but you're much harder to one-shot through the turret if hit with Sabo or heat. There is a chance the round will hit ammo, but most of the time a round will just take out 1 or 2 crew members and disable the breach and drives. And because your reverse gear is so responsive, you can easily slip away and repair. And once enemies stop coming into sight, then you can use the mobility to push out of cover into the map, picking off enemies and driving from cover to cover. You can easily still play like this as long as you're not spotted. So the Leo is still versatile in that sense as long as you don't push it. You really don't want to be caught in the open, especially as if you get into a situation where you and an enemy snapshot each other, chances are you'll come off worse. All your rounds apart from Hesh, which I wouldn't consider maining, have a fairly damaging but narrow cone of damage, so if you do snapshot and don't aim for critical components, it is possible you won't disable your enemy's ability to fire, whereas it's very likely that your enemy will be able to disable you. So what I'm trying to say really is, although it might seem tempting to use your newfound mobility from the offset and push it to the max, it won't keep you alive for very long. Sit back, snipe, and you'll easily get the best out of the Leo. Pros: great firepower, great mobility, and versatile. Now the cons: poor survivability. Verdict isn't important, is it? Of course, get it, it's a really functional vehicle, and it'll likely take a lot of getting used to, but once you crack it, you'll have a great time. And as it's fairly similar to later tanks as well, getting good with the Leo 1 will set you up nicely for the other MBTs down the line. Next up, our anti-air this tier, the Kugelblitz. This vehicle is on the standard Panzer IV hull and is equipped with 2 30mm guns, Mk103s, which are actually the same ones found on aircraft like the Me-410, HS-129 and the Dornier 335s. They're pretty effective against aircraft, but are a bit harder to aim than some of the previous anti-airs. Before this vehicle, all German anti-airs either used the 20mm cannons or the 37mm cannons, which largely all lead the same. So by this point, you're probably very used to one or the other, and as the Kugel uses a completely new cannon, adjusting to the lead might be tricky to start out with. Once you start connecting shots though, the damage output will be pretty effective. Also, as it uses the Mk103s, it does have access to a belt that contains an HVAP round that can pen 95mm of flat armour, which is pretty good for an AA like this. It can penetrate pretty much all tanks side on, and frontally it can take out barrels and tracks pretty easily as well. As far as playstyle goes, there's not really a huge amount I can say that you don't already know. If you're attacking aircraft, make sure you're not in the open, and if you have only around 50 rounds or so remaining, flush the rest of the belt and reload a new one. The Kugel has a 13-second stock reload, so you don't want to be caught out with no ammo. As long as you can make sure you engage with enough ammunition, you should do fine on both fronts. Although it might take some time to practice your lead with the guns, as they do have a fairly disparate velocity to the anti-airs you've used so far. It's fair to say it's a bit less effective against aircraft than the Ostwind 2, just down to the velocity and the reload, but it's much more survivable as the turret isn't open-topped, and it can deal with some tanks somewhat effectively. So overall it has slightly less anti-air potential, but much more versatility. Pros: good anti-tank ability, versatile, and decent survivability for an AA. The cons: long reload, and average anti-air ability. Verdict: I'd still get it. It's far from unusable against aircraft, it'll still do really well. It might just take a while to get the lead and work around the reload. And once you unlock the HVAP belt, you can hunt tanks to a certain degree as well. Overall, it's not the easiest to use, but it's fairly versatile for an anti-air, so it'll do well around this BR. So next up is the last World War II era tank in the research tree, the Jagdtiger. a vehicle with some overwhelming advantages and overwhelming drawbacks. First of these advantages is of course the armour. The front of the casemate is 250mm thick, making the Jagdtiger frontally invulnerable from most APHE and AP rounds, with only Sabo and Heat getting through. It's on the hull of the King Tiger as well, so the armour there is the same, meaning that the only frontal weak spot really is the lower plate, which can be cut through by early Sabo and some high caliber AP and APHE rounds. For its cannon, it's of course equipped with the 128, which is devastating if it penetrates, but it's let down a little bit by the reload, as despite having 2 loaders, the reload speed stock is 23.6 seconds, which is a very long time and gives your enemies ample opportunity to flank you. Which is a fairly easy thing to do, as this tank is incredibly slow and unresponsive. If an enemy gets close to you, there's not a huge amount you can do, as the Jagdtiger's ability to turn and maneuver, even when spaded, is very poor. So all of this of course leads to a playstyle more suited to engaging enemies at distances, which negates a lot of this tank's drawbacks. The lack of mobility doesn't become a huge issue, and while the long reload isn't negated, it does make you less vulnerable because of it, which is the best you can do really. While playing this tank, it's important to recognise which enemies actually pose a threat to you. This is predominantly anything British, or tanks that can fire post-war heat shells. Unless at very close range, the majority of Russian tanks and World War II era vehicles equipped only with AP and APHE can't really scratch this thing. So if you're being attacked by multiple enemies, always prioritise the British and tanks that you know can fire heat, such as the American light tanks and the Japanese if they're on the other team. The Jagdtiger works great at range, but it will rarely excel here just down to the reload and lack of targets. The Jagdtiger has the most drastic impact on the match when it's used as a wall. This thing's armour is so consistent at 6.7 and 7.0 that you can just park it at the end of a road watching over a cap and just completely halt the enemy's advance. There will be some tanks that can take you out, but if you prioritise them, the majority of the tanks that can't pen you will just be stuck. This vehicle is fairly scary, so you'll commonly find some enemies will just refuse to be aggressive and try and push you, and this is where I'd aim to play. I would only really do this though if you're not up tiered past around 7.3, as then you'll start seeing a lot of tanks that can deal with you quite easily. And anyway, for those battle ratings, you do have several light vehicles at 6.7 and below that can be used more effectively. In any case, try and position yourself against some form of hard cover. Don't leave yourself open to multiple sides, as this tank is hugely vulnerable to being flanked. Also, always keep an eye on the positions of your teammates, as from that you can somewhat reliably assume where enemies are or aren't. If there's a potential route an enemy could take to flank you and your team aren't in the area, consider repositioning. If a long-range sightline isn't available though, and you fancy being a bit more aggressive, stick with your team and be a sort of battering ram for them. As long as you have friendlies covering your sides, you can advance and take shots while also periodically firing back, as from the front the Jagdtiger is a fairly hard vehicle to take out quickly. It'll usually require a few shots, so if you're with your team and getting peppered by Sabo, they'll hopefully help you out before you lose all your crew. Pros: great firepower and great armour. The cons: poor mobility and long reload. What's our verdict? I'd get it. It rounds off the 6.7 lineup well, and as this thing is top tier, it can really disrupt the enemy team's advance if you're positioned well. I'd aim to stay with your team, watch your sides, and don't get too close to your enemies. If you can find a good medium between all these parts, you'll have a great time in the Jagdtiger. First for our removed vehicles this tier is the Tiger II 105. Despite the obvious change in firepower, it's actually fairly different to the regular Tiger II. Armour is the same, but the 105 comes with a rangefinder, an extra crew member in the turret, and 200 extra horsepower in the engine, making it much more responsive, which is great. The APHE round it gets as well is really devastating. It can punch through a max of 251mm of armour, with a filler of just under 350 grams of TNT equivalent. But because of the 2-part ammo, the reload is much longer at 20 seconds stock. Again, this tank was removed as it's essentially a concept vehicle, but because of the ever high demand, it'll likely come back again in the future in some earnable form, albeit in limited numbers. It's a great vehicle, but somewhat overshadowed by the Panther II in terms of what it adds to the game, but the mobility upgrades tied with the excellent killing power of the gun make it a very effective vehicle. So next up, sadly another removed vehicle, the Maus. Now this tank wasn't removed because it was unhistorical in any way, it was removed because it was too difficult to fairly balance, or so the official line goes. At 7.7 it just became food for 8.7s, and it couldn't really be moved down because it could then meet 6.3s, and most of them couldn't fairly counter it, especially considering the backups they take. You see a lot of pedantic arguments going around from players insisting it would be fine at 7.3 or lower, just on the basis that it's technically possible for those tanks tanks to knock it out in the absolute perfect circumstances, but in reality and practice it would just be too big a problem for most players, so I can see the reasoning, but personally I don't really think it should have been removed. Either they're trying to create some artificial rarity with it, or they're waiting to introduce some more changes before reintroducing it where it'll be a little bit more viable. We don't really know. If you ask me, they should have just left it where it was and buffed the reload. It has a huge interior and 2 loaders, so thematically it could have easily been given a shorter reload. I know in real life one loader was strictly for the 128 and one was for the 75, but in this case I think historical liberties can be fairly taken. Anyway though, the mouse for now is gone, new players can't research it, so I won't spend too much time covering it. It's a very interesting vehicle that could potentially work very well and has some great defensive and defensive qualities. We will 100% see it back in some form or another in the future. Maybe after some changes it'll be added back to the research tree, but if not, it will come back through events where you can earn it for yourself. More likely what will happen is that it'll be added back to the game for a week or so and you'll have the ability to research it over that week. They did something similar with the LA-174. And when it comes back, it is really worth picking up. It can be tedious and not very fun to play at times, but you can occasionally have some brilliant games in it. So I'd say it's well worth dedicating the time to earn it when the time comes. Next up is an event vehicle, the E100, quite the legendary tank in the game. The E100 is essentially the Mao's turret on a more manoeuvrable and arguably better protected hull. The E100 is reserved for those who want to pay around €1,000 or for the top performing players in tournaments where it sometimes appears. It performs basically like the Mao's but is slightly less held back by the mobility, although it still suffers from the same issues overall. It can currently be found on the marketplace for ludicrously high prices, which I don't recommend paying unless you're an oil baron. It's a great tank, but like the Mao's, it suffers from power creep, up tiers and a very high repair cost, but in any case, if you feel like putting your skills to the test, around once a year or so it does pop up in select tournaments. So if you're feeling confident, you could potentially nab it for yourself, but it likely won't be an easy fight. So best of luck. Next up is our one and only premium tank this tier, the German M47. It's basically the same as the American version, although the German model gets smoke grenades. And for some reason, the reload rate stock and upgraded is 0.1 seconds slower on the German version. They must have smaller hands. Anyway, apart from those things, the tank is the same and very effective. It's a lot like a more mobile and responsive M48 really. The M48 can technically go faster, but the 47 averages out at a much faster speed. It can also turn and reverse much faster as well, and on top of this, the turret traverse is very quick at 25.2 seconds on a stock crew. The only notable drawback really is the gun depression at only -5 degrees, which isn't unusable by any means, but it will still limit the spots where you can play effectively. The armour as well is pretty good, but not really any better than the M48. The frontal hull will bounce most APHE rounds, but the turret has a fair few weak spots. Much like the M48, you'll survive some snapshots taken at you, but in no way is the armour reliable. The firepower is basically identical to the M48, it fires the exact same heat and APHE round. It also gets an AP shot and some APCR, but they're a bit redundant really. There's not a lot else I can really add to this vehicle without retreading the playstyle of the M48, they function very similarly. The M47 even has a rangefinder, so as well, long range sniping and cover is even more viable this time around, as you don't have a huge cupola. Because of the speed and effectiveness of the turret drive, you can afford to play this one on the flanks and be a bit more aggressive with it. Compared to the M48, the only real drawback is the turret armour, but even then you can counter that by not having a cupola, so overall it is pretty good. Again, it's a jack of all trades really. Pros: great mobility, great firepower, and decent armour. The cons: all I can really put here is inconsistent survivability. Is it worth it? Well, at this tier where everything gets pretty expensive, it's hard to say off the bat as the potential RP and silver line earnings are pretty high, although the price is very steep at 8,200 GE, which will set you back just under €50. As it's tier 5, it can help you research tier 6 effectively, which is important as there are a lot of vehicles there. However, for this price you could potentially buy around 3 talismans in tier 6 and have some GE left over, which is a lot more useful. And as well, the M47 doesn't have huge longevity in the higher tiers. Its killing power most of the time relies on heat, which is negated a fair bit in the higher tiers due to ERA and some spaced armour, so it doesn't have huge potential for longevity. It works great at its own BR, but as soon as you start seeing ERA and stabilizers, it does lose its edge a bit. And because of that, even though it's good, I'm going to say it's not worth it. It's a lot of money for something that you can't really keep using for long. It's really versatile and will work great at its tier, but for just under 50 euros you're going to want something a bit more substantial. So I'd focus on talismans really, they have much more value when it comes to grinding RP. It's a good silver lion earner, but you can get even better ones for a lot cheaper. First up for the planes is a squadron vehicle, the ME262A1U1. It's basically a 262 with more armament in the nose. It gets 6 cannons, 2 20s, 2 low velocity 30s, and 2 high velocity 30s that can fire full HVAP belts. So it's a decent versatile aircraft to take, as if you can maintain your speed, you can easily deal with enemy aircraft and tanks alike. I wouldn't say it's worth paying to unlock it, but if you are in a squadron and want to passively grind for this one, it would be a good choice. Next up is the Arado 234C3. This variant has 4 engines instead of 2 and 2 20mm cannons in the nose. Its bomb load is the same as the B variant 2 drops, but this time around because of the extra speed and cannons it's a lot more versatile. This thing really hates losing speed as well, so after you drop your bombs you can easily disrupt the enemy fighters or attackers. Despite its size, it's just agile enough to boom and zoom and even turn a little bit with enemy fighters as long as you can keep your speed high. It's very versatile and a decent choice to take at 7377. Last up is sort of an honourable mention in the Horton 229 V3. This aircraft used to be exceptional a few years ago, but it's been heavily nerfed. It's equipped with 2 30mm cannons with HVAP, but the armour-piercing belt it gets is only 1/4 HVAP, with the rest being tracers and API rounds. On top of this, the accuracy isn't very good either. I'm still mentioning it though, as its flight performance is brilliant. It can very easily strafe ground targets and attack aircraft as long as you have a good angle. I wouldn't take it out personally, but it does still have its use. I'd keep an eye on updates to the game regarding the Horton, as if its accuracy and belts are corrected, it'll be a fantastic cast plane again. So even though it's not really great right now, I still thought it'd be worth mentioning here. So there we are guys, really hope you enjoyed the video. On screen now are the best lineups I think you can make from tier 5, including the revamped 6.7 with the Jagdtiger. The main lineup here really is 7.7, as 7.0 really just relies on the M48 being top tier to work really well. But in any case, the 7.7 lineup is pretty good, and I'd focus on going through the light tank line, getting the Bulldog and the BMP, and then the M48 to use as a backup when you get the Leopard, and then replace it with the Rakitan once you get it unlocked. That's what I do anyway. There's loads of different ways you can sort of structure the lineups here anyway, so whatever you kind of prefer, if you like the more mobile tanks, the more armored tanks, like there's different options for you, especially with planes as well. They all work quite well in slightly different ways. So yeah, sorry this video took longer than it should have done. I sort of got ambushed by a friend earlier this month who decided to stay for a week, so I got basically nothing done, which really held everything back a bit, but finally here, huzzah. And the next one probably won't take this long, hopefully, if I can really kind of crack it. There's a lot of vehicles in tier 6, and what I'll probably do is make tier 6 and tier 7 the same video. There's no point sort of splitting it, it just seems arbitrary. And also another thing that held it back annoyingly, which I will complain about, my rent got increased, so I had to kind of focus on doing the framing stuff a little bit more, just to make sure I could make a bit more of a buffer, so that annoyingly had to come before this for the time being. But I think I've sort of sorted a system which works, and I'm sort of working on some time management stuff, and hopefully it'll all sort of round off, and I'll be able to just really kind of kick it into gear. I wanted to focus a lot on the YouTube stuff this year and just see how far I can get with it. So hopefully it'll all be okay, and whatever I choose to do next after this will be quite streamlined as well. Hopefully. Anyway, I will stop rambling and let you get on with your day. So yeah, thank you all very, very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time for the finale. All the best. Goodbye.